Okay, imagine this. A secret doesn't come out in some, hushed whisper. Instead, it's laid bare right in the courtroom.
Stark contrast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into a Hong Kong legal case from back in 1998, case number CACC 65297. It's about a woman, let's call her Zang San, who confessed to, get this, 20 counts of fraud.
20 counts. That's significant.
It is, and it's not just the number.
Yeah.
It's this really tangled story about trust, betrayal, and how deception can just ripple through a community, in this case, a community of school parents.
Right. The very people you'd assume share a certain level of trust because of their kids.
Precisely. Think about that vulnerability.
Hi there. And yeah, here on the Deep Dive, that's what we try to do, right? We take something pretty complex, like this court judgment, the appeal judgment for Zang San, and we try to pull out what really matters for you.
We dig into the source material.
Yeah, we look beyond the legal jargon. We want to understand what actually happened, the arguments, the outcome, but also the human side, the ethics involved. Why does a case like this stick with you?
Okay, so let's jump right in. The core of it is Zang San's confession. She pleaded guilty.
To 20 charges. The official term is obtaining property by deception. It's fraud, essentially, under Section 17(1) of the Theft Ordinance in Hong Kong.
Basically, tricking people out of their money.
Yes. And the people she tricked, they weren't strangers off the street.
No, that's a key point. Who were they?
There were 4 other parents. Their children were classmates with Zang San's daughter.
Wow. So people in her immediate circle, people she likely saw regularly, maybe chatted with at school pickup.
Exactly. Which just heightens that sense of violation, of trust being broken.
Absolutely. And this wasn't a one-off thing. It happened over quite a period.
Yeah, the time frame mentioned is August 1995 to February 1997, so about 18 months.
And how did she do it? What were the methods?
Well, the judgment mentions a few different tactics, representing fake investments in various businesses, proposing joint property purchases that, never actually happened.
Okay, typical investment scam sort of things.
Sort of. But also some quite specific stuff, like saying she needed funds to buy birds' nests.
Birds' nests? Really?
Yeah, it sounds almost trivial, but it speaks to how deception can be woven into, everyday life and cultural contexts, using something familiar to gain trust.
That's a fascinating detail. It makes it feel more personal somehow.
Yeah.
And the total amount involved.
Across all the charges, she obtained around 460,000 Hong Kong dollars.
Wow. That's a substantial sum, especially back in the mid-90s.
Definitely. Enough to cause real financial hardship.
But there's a twist, isn't there? She did return some of it.
Yes, that's right. About $120,000 HKD was repaid to the victims over time. But crucially, it was often framed as profits from the fake investment.
Oh, so that wasn't genuine repayment. It was part of the scam itself.
Seems like it. A way to keep the victims believing, to keep them invested, literally, and stop them getting suspicious too soon. Very calculated.
So the net loss was still huge, around $340,000 HKD, right?
Correct. $340,000 that the 4 families were ultimately out of pocket. And you have to think, it's not just the money, it's the feeling of being duped by someone you trusted in your community.
Yeah, the emotional toll. The judgment breaks it down per victim, doesn't it? Shows it was repeated.
It does. Let's see. The first victim hit 9 times, amounts ranging from $7,500 up to $50,000, totaled about $180,000 minus $40,000 she gave back as profit.
Okay, victim 2.
6 instances for the second victim, smaller amounts starting around $3,800, but also up to $50,000. Lost around $120,000 total, but got $70,000 back as those fake profits.
So she got more back, proportionally. Maybe kept that one going longer.
Possibly. Victim 3, just 2 instances, but bigger sums, $15,000 and $85,000. And interestingly, they were given a bounce check for nearly $79,000, supposedly profit, in late '96. That must have been a red flag.
A bounce check, yeah, you'd think so. And the last victim?
Victim 4, 3 instances, ranged from $5,000 to $40,000, total loss $60,000, no mention of repayments there.
So systematic, repeated deception against multiple people she knew. And why? Did she say what the money was for?
She admitted it. Gambling and just general household expenses.
Gambling. Often a factor in these kinds of cases. Such a contrast between the trust she exploited and where the money actually went.
It really is.
So after the confession, she goes to the district court for sentencing. What happened there?
Well, the judge took a pretty stern approach, gave her 2 months imprisonment for each of the 20 charges.
Okay, 2 months each.
But crucially, ordered them to be served consecutively.
Consecutively. So one after the other, like stacking them up.
Exactly. 20 charges times 2 months. That adds up.
40 months, which is what, 3 years and 4 months?
Correct. A total sentence of 40 months imprisonment.
That feels like a long time, especially given the individual sentences were short.
It is a significant sentence. And Zang San, or her lawyers, certainly thought so. They appealed.
On what grounds?
The main arguments were, first, that the total sentence of 40 months was manifestly excessive, just too harsh for the crimes committed.
Okay, too long overall.
And second, that the original judge didn't properly apply the totality principle.
The totality principle. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. It's a legal concept in sentencing, basically saying that when someone's convicted of multiple offenses, the judge needs to step back and look at the overall sentence to make sure it's just and proportionate to the defendant's total criminality. You don't just blindly add up all the individual sentences. You need to consider the whole picture.
Right, so the overall punishment should fit the overall crime, not just be a mathematical sum.
That's the idea. Her counsel argued the 40 months didn't reflect that principle. They even cited another case, Cheng Yuk Kwai from 1987.
What was the point of bringing up that older case?
They suggested Cheng Yuk Kwai was actually a more serious fraud case. More charges, maybe higher amounts, I'm not sure on the specifics, but resulted in a shorter overall sentence. Trying to show a disparity, basically arguing Zang San's sentence was unfairly high by comparison.
Okay, so using precedent to argue for leniency, how did the prosecution respond to that?
Well, the prosecution pushed back. They argued that Cheng Yuk Kwai wasn't like a binding guideline that had to be followed. Each case is different.
Makes sense.
And they argued the appeal court shouldn't interfere unless the original judge made a really obvious error. They stressed the factors against Zang San: the sheer number of offenses, the serious breach of trust with people she knew.
The parent community aspect again.
Exactly. And the fact that full restitution, getting all the money back, hadn't happened. They also made the point that these weren't really one single incident. They were separate crimes against different people at different times, so maybe consecutive sentencing was appropriate.
So, competing arguments about how to calculate the right sentence. This leads us to the appeal court's decision. How did they see it?
The appeal court. Well, they sort of sided with the defense on the method of sentencing, at least initially. They agreed that simply handing out short consecutive sentences for each charge, adding them all up, wasn't the best way to go about it here.
Why not?
They felt it didn't really allow for a proper consideration of the overall seriousness, the totality, as we discussed. It didn't properly weigh the individual circumstances of each instance of fraud within the larger pattern.
Okay, so they preferred a different approach. What did they suggest?
Yeah, they outlined what they saw as a better way for these kinds of multiple offense cases. First, identify the most serious offenses as a starting point, then consider the number and severity of all the offenses. Look at any relevant guidelines or similar cases, like Cheng Yuk Kwai.
Okay, establish a baseline.
Right. Then factor in any mitigating circumstances, like Zang San's guilty plea, which usually counts for something. And then arrive at a total sentence that reflects the overall criminality, applying that totality principle. Usually this means making the sentences for individual charges run concurrently.
Concurrently, so side by side, not stacked up.
Exactly. Imagine sentences running in parallel, and the total time served is determined by the longest one, generally speaking. That's the more common approach the appeal court favored, rather than strict consecutive addition.
That sounds like a more holistic way to look at it. Did they agree with the defense about the Cheng Yuk Kwai comparison too?
They did, actually. They looked at the details and agreed that Zang San's case, while serious, was overall less severe than Cheng Yuk Kwai.
In what ways?
Fewer victims, the deception happened over a shorter period, the total money involved was less, and there were fewer separate instances of fraud. So, comparing the two, they felt Zang San's situation warranted a lesser sentence than perhaps Cheng Yuk Kwai did, relatively speaking.
Okay, so less severe overall and a preference for concurrent sentences. How did they apply this to Zang San's 20 charges? Did they lump them all together?
Not quite. They took a structured approach. They grouped the 20 charges based on the victims, so 4 groups of offenses.
One group per parent she defrauded. Makes sense.
Precisely. And then they set a sentence for each group, with the sentences within that group running concurrently.
Okay, what were those sentences?
For victim 1, who faced 9 offenses, the sentence was set at 15 months. For victim 2, with 6 offenses, it was 12 months. For victim 3, the 2 offenses got 8 months. And for victim 4, the 3 offenses also got 8 months.
15, 12, 8, and 8 months. And within each of those blocks, the time runs concurrently.
Correct. So no longer 20 individual 2-month sentences. Now it's 4 blocks, 15, 12, 8, and 8 months.
Okay, but wait, the final sentence wasn't 15 months, which would be the longest concurrent sentence. It was 24 months, right? How did they get from those blocks to 24?
Good question. This is where the totality principle comes back in, but applied slightly differently. The court decided that while concurrency was the general rule, simply sieving the longest single block, 15 months, wouldn't adequately reflect the overall criminality involving 4 different victims over time.
So 15 months felt too low for the whole picture.
Apparently so. They needed a way to reflect the fact that there were multiple victims and distinct sets of offenses, even while using concurrent sentences within each set. So they decided to make some of these concurrent blocks run consecutively or partially consecutively to reach a total they felt was appropriate.
Ah, okay. So concurrency within the victim groups, but some consecutiveness between the groups.
Exactly. It's a bit complex, but here's how they did it. They started with the 15 months for victim 1. Then they ordered that 6 months of the 12-month sentence for victim 2 should run consecutively to that 15 months.
So that brings it up to 21 months, 15 plus 6.
Right. Then they took the 8-month sentence for victim 3 and ordered that 3 months of that should run consecutively to the first 2.
Okay, 21 plus 3, that's 24 months.
You got it. And finally, the 8-month sentence for victim 4 was ordered to run entirely concurrently with the others, so it didn't add any extra time.
So the final tally achieved through that specific structuring of concurrent and consecutive elements was 24 months.
Correct. 2 years. A significant reduction from the original 40 months.
Wow. So the appeal was allowed, the original sentence quashed, and the new 24-month sentence imposed. It really shows how important that appeal process can be and how sentencing isn't always straightforward arithmetic.
Absolutely. It highlights the court's effort to find a balance punishing each crime but ensuring the total sentence is proportionate, and it shows the importance of principles like totality.
Beyond the legal nuts and bolts, though, what does this case tell us on a human level?
Well, I mean, the most obvious thing is the profound abuse of trust. This wasn't a scam targeting strangers online. It was within a close-knit community formed around something as fundamental as children's education.
People you see every day, people you likely rely on for mutual support.
Exactly. And that trust was weaponized, used as the very tool for the deception. The emotional fallout for those victims must have been immense, quite apart from the financial loss. Anger, embarrassment, perhaps questioning their own judgment.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It probably damaged relationships within that parent group more broadly, too. Suspicion creeping in.
Very possibly. It also shows, kind of disturbingly, how these things can escalate. The judgment details suggest maybe smaller amounts were involved initially, testing the waters perhaps.
Building confidence before going for larger sums.
Maybe. It highlights how small lies, small breaches of ethics, if unchecked, can snowball into something much bigger and more destructive.
And that tactic of paying back fake profits.
Oh, that's particularly insidious, isn't it? It's not just deception. It's active manipulation to prolong the fraud. It keeps hope alive for the victims while digging them deeper into the hole. It makes the eventual discovery even more of a betrayal.
It really paints a picture of calculated deception over a long period.
It does. It's a stark reminder that, unfortunately, you can't always take trust for granted, even in communities that feel safe and familiar. It underlines the need for, well, a degree of healthy vigilance.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, we looked at the 1998 Hong Kong case of Zang San. 20 counts of fraud against fellow parents.
A net loss of around $340,000 HKD, fueled by gambling and household needs.
An initial tough sentence of 40 months, based on consecutive terms.
Which was then appealed successfully. The appeal court emphasized the totality principle.
Right, leading to a revised approach.
Yeah.
Grouping offenses by victim, running sentences concurrently within groups, but making some parts consecutive between groups to reach a final sentence.
Which ended up being 24 months, a judgment that tried to balance the individual crimes with the overall pattern and the breach of community trust.
It's a complex intersection of law, community, trust, and, well, human weakness.
Definitely. The legal mechanics of sentencing are fascinating, especially how courts grapple with multiple offenses and the totality principle, trying to ensure fairness and proportionality.
And it leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? You know, in your own circles, your own communities, how much do you rely on assumed trust versus maybe a little bit of healthy skepticism?
It's a tricky balance. This case shows how devastating it can be when that trust is exploited. What red flags might we miss? How easily can deception take root, even among people we think we know?
Yeah. What does it tell us about temptation, maybe, and how seemingly small deceptions can unravel, causing widespread harm? Lots to mull over.